Thank you for coming. Thank you. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Program Associate for South Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia program. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor for today's event, that being the Wilson Center's Middle East program, and specifically Hale Isfandiari, who I think had seen earlier, as well as her colleagues Mona Yusuf and Kendra Heidemann. Let me offer just a very brief word about the Wilson Center for those of you that may be here for the first time. We are the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD. We serve as a gathering place for scholars and other experts who inform the world's public policy debates. We seek to build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy in order to inform and develop solutions to policy problems and challenges. The Wilson Center has been blessed in recent years to have hosted a number of prominent journalists and writers who have spent time here as public policy scholars and gone ahead to publish very timely and often very influential books on various aspects of public policy and international security. These people include, just over the last year or two, Rajiv Chandrasekaran of the Washington Post, David Wessel of the Wall Street Journal, Mark Mazzetti, David Sanger, and Helene Cooper of the New York Times. And to that impressive canon has been added the name Linda Robinson, who earlier this month published her latest book, 100 Victories, Special Ops, and the Future of American Warfare. The book, as you probably noticed, is being sold outside, so you're all cordially invited to purchase a copy afterward. And I understand that Linda has kindly said that she would be happy to inscribe your copy after the event. 100 Victories is a study of U.S. Special Ops Forces based largely on Linda's on-the-ground presence in Afghanistan over much of the last 2 years, during which she spent much time with Special Ops Forces. The book chronicles what she describes, as I understand it, as the Special Ops Forces transformation from teams that undertake specialized targeted missions of force to teams that undertake strategic long-term missions to build local security from the ground up. And she makes the argument that these forces will likely represent the future of American warfare and globally, not just in Afghanistan. You should have her bio in front of you. She's currently a senior international policy analyst at RAND, and she was a Wilson Center public policy scholar earlier this year. She's been an adjunct senior fellow at CFR. She's also been author in residence at the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at SAIS, and she has reported on national security issues, military issues, international issues for U.S. News and World Report, and also is an editor at Foreign Affairs. She's written books previously on the U.S. Army Special Forces and on the war in Iraq. She's conducted field research on special ops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Latin America, and elsewhere over the past 12 years, and she's earned a reputation as a foremost expert on special ops forces. So she'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we should have plenty of time for a discussion, for a Q&A. So with that, I will defer to Linda.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for coming. I want to also thank Hale and Bob Hathaway and Rob Litwack and everyone else here. I spent the last 4 months of my book writing in this very civilized think tank, so I enjoyed it greatly. And I have been think tank hopping for the past few years in my post-journalism career. I don't call myself a journalist anymore because I consider journalists to be people working for media outlets. But certainly my entire career has been spent going out to places, gathering information, watching things on the ground, and writing. So there's a continuity to what I've been doing. And since 9/11, actually before 9/11, I began digging into the area of Special Operations Forces. I spent a lot of time in Colombia, first covering that war, and then as I got access to the Special Operations Forces there, began writing and reporting on them. And that's really turned into kind of a subset of what I do and something of a specialty. I would like to really encourage you to ask me and make comments about any aspect that you are interested in. I want to talk to you, of course, about the book, and the locus of most of that research was in Afghanistan, but most of these special operators have spent quite a bit of time all around the world and brought some of their experiences and insights to Afghanistan, and I saw this book topic as very much lending itself to an exploration of how they might be used in the future, and specifically whether some of the things that they were doing in Afghanistan and some of the evolutionary aspects of how they were being used and how they operated, whether those would be applicable to other theaters as well. So I definitely am going to talk to you about Afghanistan and what went on there and the evolution there, but the book topic is much broader. So I'd encourage you to bring any thoughts you have into the discussion period. I'd like to start with just a quick baseline of who U.S. Special Operations Forces are, because it's not a terribly well understood part of the U.S. military. And I have to say I kind of push back against some of the popular versions or popular caricatures, because they tend to focus overwhelmingly on the unilateral direct action uses of Special Operations Forces, and they have grown substantially since 9/11. Their total size now of uniformed special operators are 33,000. So that's much larger than most people realize. That is over doubling of their previous size. They've also been deployed to more places for longer periods than any time previously in their history. Their op tempo, as it's called, their operational tempo, has almost tripled. Now those figures will probably come down in the years ahead, partly because we are winding down in Afghanistan, and of course we've left Iraq. And I do also believe their size will diminish as the overall U.S. military contracts due to the budget cuts, because most of these special ops forces are recruited out of the conventional forces. So as their pool of recruits shrinks, as they seek to maintain their standards, it would follow logically that their overall size is going to reduce somewhat. Now, of course, the Special Operations Command is intent upon making the case that their utility and the high demand for them argues for maintaining their budget and perhaps a disproportionately small budget cut, but I do think they will be declining to some degree in size in the years ahead. And that's going to force, I think, some hard choices about where and how they are used. The final note about sort of snapshot of the Special Ops Forces is they come from all branches. Army Special Operations constitutes the largest share. They are half, easily half of the total. And of that Army half, over half of those are what are called the Army Special Forces, or Green Berets as they are colloquially known. The other elements of Army Special Ops include Civil Affairs, PSYOP, Rangers, Army Aviation, which are the helicopter pilots and crews. There's also Air Force Special Operations. Those are the airplane pilots and their ground personnel, which include combat controllers. And those are the individuals that are united with the ground forces to call in the airstrikes. So, for example, everywhere that I went in Afghanistan to see the Special Ops ground teams, they would have one combat controller there with that 12 to 16 man team. And it was an interesting position for, the lone Air Force guy to be out there with either Army, Marine, or Navy SEAL teams. But it was an example of what they like to tout as their joint approach to warfare. And I mentioned the Marine Special Operations. Those are the newest element of the Special Operations family. They were formed in 2006. So that's the snapshot part. Let me talk to you a little bit about my project in Afghanistan. I had been out in Afghanistan early in the war after 9/11, then I spent a lot of time in Iraq, and then I came back in 2009 to resume my focus on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I noticed a civil defense initiative beginning. It initially had the name Community Defense Initiative and Local Defense Initiative. It then was renamed yet again into Village Stability Operations and Afghan Local Police. That is a long mouthful of words for a program, but it's important to break it down into its two components. The Village Stability Operations was an approach of stability operations, going into these villages and trying to find out what the drivers of conflict were, and working with the tribal elders and the population of the village to see what they could do to address those sources of conflict. And those could range from disputes, inter-tribal disputes, water disputes, property disputes, and many of these long-running feuds were things that the Taliban would come in and exploit for their gain. So it's a very complex situation, and these teams would have to spend quite a bit of time simply learning about the details of what was going on in the village. Then, if the village elders wanted to form a local volunteer defense force, they would hold a shura, they would have a vote, they would agree to do so, and then they would nominate some of the young males in the village to join this force. And at that point, the special operations teams would train those civil defenders in basic techniques. They were not to be an offensive force, so the training they got was fairly rudimentary. And many of these Afghans were farmers. Some of them had experience before, previous perhaps military experience. Perhaps they'd been part of militia in years gone by. I'll speak to you about one particular individual down in Kandahar who was a member of what was called the Gomai militia from the Soviet era. So anyway, they would take these individuals, and they were limited to 300 volunteers per district. District is roughly a county equivalent. So this, the design of this program was very strict about it being the villagers' decision as to whether or not they wanted to form this force, and its defensive nature, and finally that it be capped at 300. That there was an exception made to go up to 400 in a couple of districts, but it was pretty uniformly enforced that 300 was the limit. And again, the idea was that these were to be local defenders. They were not to be used and taken off somewhere for offensive purposes, nor were they to be used to create a militia of 10, 20, 30,000. And that's why they were kind of at pains to not use the term militia, because that does connote to many in the Afghan context a 10, 20, 30,000 man force, such as the warlords of previous decades had at their disposal. So this is a key distinction, and we can talk about it more if you would like. So I wanted to watch this initiative unfold, and it did represent quite a turnabout from the way in which the Special Operations Forces had been interacting and operating in Afghanistan. Early in the war, of course, this is very famous, went in with CIA teams and partnered with the Northern Alliance militia to topple the Taliban. And in that case, they were partnered, but they were very much on the offense. And they continued that use of indigenous partnering for many years. They were really using them in a counterterrorism mode. They would have Afghan forces, they would go out and launch raids on targets and go hunting Taliban. And it was not at all village-based, and there was no real attempt made to do community building, governance, economic, look into any of those issues. It was very strictly focused on going, as one special operator I quote said, we would round up our indige and go hit targets. Indige is sort of their operator slang for indigenous forces. So it was really kind of an expedient use of the local forces rather than saying what do they want, how do they want to defend themselves, if indeed they do, and how can we help them. So it was really quite a contrast with the early years. I wanted to see whether it would work. This was the largest such initiative that they had undertaken since Vietnam. In fact, it was their largest and most sustained deployment of anywhere, of any type since Vietnam, and in fact ended up exceeding in length the Vietnam deployments. In Vietnam, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group was the local defense initiative, and that wound up growing to 50,000, so it was quite large. The numbers in Afghanistan had only just about reached 30,000, and as they continue to vet their ranks and there is some attrition, it's somewhere between 25 and 30,000 now, so it's not numerically as large an Afghan force as it was a Vietnamese force, which was principally the hill tribes, the Montagnard Hill tribes then. But it was similar in concept in terms of providing for local defense. In the Vietnam era, there was not quite as great a focus on the stability operations component. This was touted in the early 2009 period as they were getting this off the ground as a potential game changer for the war in Afghanistan. I will talk to you in a few minutes about what I saw as the effects, and I guess I would just give you a little headline here that I don't think it could be considered a game changer, but I think it was a very important initiative. It grew to 25,000. It exists in all parts of the country, and it certainly, in many cases of this rural insurgency, was the dominant effort going on in many of these areas. It certainly reoriented U.S. Special Operations Forces away from their unilateral and combat focus. They were now doing a much more complex mission, and frankly, shooting was really the least of their tasks. They had a lot of time spent with various population groups. They would have to come in ready to fight, to defend themselves, because these small teams were out there where there were no other conventional forces, usually no Afghan army forces. And I think a little known fact is the Afghan police do largely stay in the major population areas and along the major transit routes. So it was really an effort focused on the no man's land, the hinterlands, if you will, of Afghanistan. And I'd like to note, this was the major focus of my research there. I came and went over 2 years, as Michael said, but I was also tracking the effort they were making to raise an Afghan special operations force. And that grew substantially during the time I was visiting Afghanistan. Right now, the Afghan Special Operations Command consists of the commandos, which was their earliest unit. Then out of the commandos, they began forming special forces units, and those teams were formed very much in the mold of the Green Berets with the same kind of mix of specialties, and those Afghan Special Forces teams were partnered out in many of those locations that I went to visit. So they were really working with the villagers along with the U.S. Special Operators. And in many cases, I saw very effective teams, and obviously, since they were all Afghans, all completely fluent, they were really a vital connector. And even if they were from a different ethnic group, it was apparent that they brought a lot to the mix. The other thing I was tracking, although with much smaller focus, was the enormous number of coalition special operations forces that were in Afghanistan, partnered with the U.S. Special Ops. And this has not really been covered at all. I think a few stories were published about it, but there were 24 coalition partners at the peak with special ops units there, which I think would amaze most people. Their traditional allies is, Britain, Norway, New Zealand, but also new units like Estonia, Croatia, Lithuania, a lot of countries that have recently formed, Romania, Poland, recently formed special ops units. So it was an opportunity for them to really train in the field in live operations with the U.S. Special Operators. And I have to say, I think this is one of the key features that will be applicable to the future. There already are coalition SOF operating with U.S. forces in other places, but I think you will see more and more of this going on, and possibly even the coalition SOF leading some missions with the U.S. in support. The final element that I looked at over in Afghanistan was the evolution of the special operations chain of command. And this is kind of gets into the internal institutional business and a bit into the weeds, but it is important because for all the time that I've been observing and doing my field work on special operations forces, they've had separate command structures. The constituent elements of the special operations community have not been unified under one command. And and I know there are some military folks in the audience, that violates a very basic principle of military unity of command. The most efficient way to employ your assets on a battlefield is to have them unified under one command structure, so you can make decisions about what should be the focus in any given operation, in any place, or any time. You have a limited number of air assets or overhead surveillance assets. Whatever it is, you need to apportion and prioritize. So this finally happened. And it's a little known fact that all of the so-called soft tribes were finally brought together under one command in Afghanistan. And that is another thing that is very much going to be, I think, a hallmark of their future employment. There was also a fair bit of interaction that I observed out in these areas with various interagency players, other members of the U.S. government team, and of course in interactions with U.S. conventional forces. And I was out in Iraq in the very early days of that war, since the beginning, frankly, and there were a lot of problems. I was in southern Iraq with a special ops unit that was nearly overrun by a Marine unit that didn't even realize they were there. I mean, the problems in those early days were enormous, simply because the two, conventional and special ops, had never worked together before. And primarily, the special operators were employed in theaters in which we were not at war, or sent in for something like a hostage rescue, in and out. Now we had, with Iraq and Afghanistan, constant deployments of both conventional and special ops. So over the last decade, they learned a lot about each other. They improved a lot in the way they worked together. But what I observed in these last 2 years of coming and going and spending a lot of time out in the field, there's still frictions, there are still problems. They generally tend to revolve around two things: who's in charge and who gets what support assets. The apportionment of transportation, the apportionment of supplies, the apportionment of intelligence, surveillance, assets. All of these things are critical. And if, you would say, well, where's the four-star command? We had a four-star command there. Why weren't they solving all these problems? That is like 6 steps up the food chain in the military hierarchy, and it's really all this friction and conflict is going on down at the bottom level between battalions and brigades, and generally speaking, it would be the division level or the 2-star level that would be in charge of working this out. I can give you some examples of this, and we can talk about it more if it interests anyone, but I just wanted to mention that it was inevitable. It was impossible to ignore that there were still friction points. Even though I was mostly focused on the special operations missions, they would inevitably come into contact in various ways with the conventional forces. My sort of headline answer to the question of, did it work? Did this village stability operations and Afghan local police initiative work? I try to summarize for those interested in bumper stickers that I think that it provided a critical increase in security in some key areas. And I did my reporting by repeat visits to the same sites, which I carefully selected because I wanted to be sure I was looking at a variety of sites in the main insurgent belt. Kunar, Paktika, Uruzgan, and Kandahar were the main provinces I focused on, for those of you familiar with the geography of Afghanistan. And so my method, if you will, was repeat visits, and then I also made some random visits so I would have some other areas to compare. I also did do some extra research, and there was a RAND research team that had a methodology based on conducting surveys, mining the significant acts database, so they were watching to see whether reported attacks declined over time, and also reviewing the sit reps or situation reports that were filed by troops. And they came up with also the same broad conclusion that in the areas where these local defense groups had been formed, within a certain radius, the amount of attacks did go down over time. Initially, it would peak, so that they explained this as the troops came in, the special ops troops came in into usually a very heavily Taliban-dominated or contested area. So there would be a certain amount of engagement and attacks, and the villagers generally would not be willing to come out, and then after a certain amount of time, they would gain confidence, come forward, volunteer for these groups, and then begin to secure their area. This is, I don't want to gloss over the many problems and the areas where it did not work. And to me, this was part of the interesting research, was just looking at the wide variety. There were places, I think Wardak province is really the poster child for where it did not work. And Wardak's an extremely troubled but extremely important province right next door to Kabul province. And we can talk about some of the dynamics there. What worked, in my view, it really required an Afghan leader, someone with charisma and courage and the respect of the local Afghans. That you really had to have a leader stand up, and then people would kind of rally to his side. So it was important that the special ops teams were there, but they alone couldn't do it. They had to have an Afghan that was really going to stand up and be the leader. The other thing that seemed to make a difference was to have someone in the Afghan government structure or someone of influence that was going to help guarantee a lifeline of logistical supplies. They would start off with help from the special operations teams, getting them vehicles, guns, pay, their monthly pay. But this was all supposed to start coming through the Afghan government, and particularly the Ministry of Interior, through the district chief of police and the provincial chief of police. Now, sometimes the district police was not interested, not competent, corrupt. That link did not always work. But sometimes the provincial chief of police was very interested. This happened in Paktika. There was a very charismatic leader who coincidentally did not come up out of the village nominating process. He was someone that the special operators had known from very early in the war. But the local elders rallied to him and endorsed him, and the provincial chief of police was a very strong backer of him. And as they began securing village after village along this key corridor, and Paktika was a place where there were very little U.S. Conventional forces, and what I observed was the Afghan army largely stayed hunkered down in its post. So that is one place where it had a major effect. Kandahar was a much more mixed picture because it's a very heavy Taliban area. It worked in some areas, it didn't in others. Where I spent the most time, Maiwan district, the special ops team spent almost a year with absolutely no there was just too much Taliban intimidation, too little interest in the villagers coming forward. There was also the economy of Western Kandahar and Helmand is, as many of you may know, is opium-based the poppy economy. And the Kandahar provincial governor was extremely aggressive in his coca eradication campaign. So you had a lot of fields being plowed up. You had, in some cases, district chiefs of police shaking down the villagers, pay me money so I don't plow up your field. In some cases, they were pulling out pumps that we had funded, the U.S. government had funded to put in for irrigation to stimulate agriculture. There was a civil affairs officer who did a very meticulous survey of all of the farmers and all the people that came into the district center in Maiwan and said, surveyed their practices, their agricultural practices, both in terms of their farm crops, wheat and others, and their poppy crop. And he found out that the U.S. donation of wheat seed had actually depressed the price they were getting for wheat. And of course, the opium tar price was very high, so it was really a no-brainer for these farmers that they were going to keep cultivating the poppy. But that intensive eradication campaign was sort of the Afghan government attacking these guys, the Afghan farmers' livelihood, and I think that caused some further friction. In addition, the Taliban was really deeply nested in one of the tribes there, the Ishaksai tribe in Maiwan, which had been cut out of both the legal and illegal sources of power in that district. So I just go into a few of these details to show the kinds of complexities that would often account for both the conflict, the amount of Taliban presence, and the lack of reception that would sometimes occur in when the special ops teams showed up and offered to help them. I went into I was always introduced to the village elders first. And again, these are very conservative, sensitive parts of the culture. I'm a female. I would always dress very conservatively and wait to be introduced into the social structure of a given village or district. But we, through the process and through my visits there, got to talk with some of the women, and they were generally really terrified of the entire project. They just, were afraid, even when women would come to their homes and talk to them, afraid they would get fingered as collaborating. And so I got to see, the whole range of reactions to the U.S. presence there. But over time, and what happened in Maiwan is there 4 old guys stood up, and I mentioned the guy from the Gomai militia, John Mohammed. There's a picture of him in the book. He had lost an eye in the Soviet-Afghan war. Old guy, you would think, how could he even get around? He brought all of his sons into the group, And these 4 Afghan local police leaders really banded together and brought Maywand into this program. And they forged a really a strong bond with the Special Operations Team, which was deployed there on multiple rotations, which was another thing that seemed to be a significantly good indicator of success, because they would get to know and trust that specific team. The John Mohammed lost one son, another son blown up by his pickup truck was blown up by a bomb, lost his arm, and the guy just kept going. He was really committed to trying to secure Maywand, and he had connections throughout beyond the district. So I think his survival, frankly, is one of those bellwethers that I'm watching, because as the U.S. draws down, they may keep an advisory presence there, but as the U.S. draws down, the inevitable question is, will it continue to work in those areas where it is working? And frankly, it's very hard, it's hard to answer that question. It really does depend on the fortitude and the desire of these Afghans to keep going. Now, if the pipeline for paying their very modest salary dries up, the question will then be, do they have enough stake in this to continue to function as a truly volunteer community watch group? Will they continue to defend their areas? And I think that in some cases, I would warrant that I think Paktika, that force will probably hold together, and another place that I mentioned, Kunar, where I spent a lot of time. Southern Kunar, the populated agricultural valley south of Asadabad to Jalalabad, key corridor there. I think that Afghan leadership has had enough time on the ground, enough mentoring with the special ops teams, and those 4 districts are now supporting each other. So I think I see enough maturity and experience that I think that's another area that could well survive. Of course, in the case of Kunar, that valley is 15 kilometers and less from the Pakistani border. So, of course, that is another key factor. What is the Pakistan attitude toward Afghanistan as we get into this transition phase? And we can talk about where things are headed writ large. I want to end, I think, with just a couple of comments. The Special Operations community has been traditionally closed to outsiders, conducting their operations in secret. I worked and tried to persuade, and I think been largely successful in gaining the access to be on the ground. There was no way I could do this book without being out there with those small teams. And I know there were a lot of concerns about, would I interfere with the mission? I was certainly another additional security risk. I've never been in the military. I don't touch any weapons, nor intend to. So I knew I represented a burden in that regard. But I did, I appreciated all the access, but to me, the only way I could write this account was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there were plenty of things out there that didn't work, that went wrong, and they're all in the book. And I feel that it's really important to try to give an unvarnished portrait. If they're going to give the access, there's no point in doing some kind of, airbrushed portrait. It's very important for people to understand what special ops can and can't do. And I do think that working with tribes and working with local civilians is a very transferable skill set that they have regained. And frankly, I was surprised. After 10 years of really focusing on combat missions, unilateral raids, whether it was SEALs, Marines, Green Berets, generally speaking, the senior NCOs, the senior non-commissioned officers, and the team leaders understood they were on a new mission now, and they had a very intensive train-up, learning about their specific area, learning about the non-military aspects of it. And I would say, though, that the younger members were not so keen on this, and a lot of them were attracted by the Call of Duty image and attracted by the direct action mission. That's why they joined the forces. So I would make the overall observation that I think they need to adjust some of the recruiting literature, and at least for those teams that they're going to want to put out in this capacity, they need to make sure that everyone knows what they've signed up for. And of course, you know, in the military, you get orders and you follow orders, and by and large, people did their jobs. But just as I got to know the teams, I knew there were some, particularly of the younger members, that were not all that keen about being out there to do this. But I think the aptitudes they're looking for are people who are interested in foreign cultures, people who don't mind living in very remote and very poor and very austere conditions. I mean, these were not, you know, they did have their basic needs met, but for 8, 9, 10, 11 months, they were out there living in a mud-walled compound called a kalat, and that was their life. So it was really very different from anything they had experienced before. And some of the things that didn't work, and I just want to seed this in here so that you understand that they had a competing program. The conventional forces had started to develop overnight local defense forces with none of the sort of protocols for nominating, vetting, training, mentoring, and that created a lot of nervousness among the special ops teams because they were worried they were going to have to inherit these quickie self-defense forces, and indeed that's what happened. And then they would just have to go through and re-vet them. In one case, they were ordered to another part of the district to form a quick force, and that, you know, these chains of command, there was really a conflict between the special ops chain of command and the conventional chain of command. Conventional command overruled the special ops command, and it occurred with a loss of life because they went into an area that they hadn't properly surveyed, full of IEDs, and, you know, tragedy results. And so I wanted to just point out that there were a few things that caused great angst over the course of the 2 years. And their book is full of these stories. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that there were, this wasn't an unmitigated success, but I saw enough things happening that made me think that it's part of the way forward for the special ops forces. It's a little bit different than you've probably read about, because most of the Afghan local police stories, if you Google this, you will find places that it didn't work, like Kas Uruzgan, a very troubled province, Hazara Pashtun, frictions. So, you know, and I'm a former member of the media, so I'm not, you know, going to just lambaste my former colleagues, but what was deemed newsworthy by many fellow journalists, and they had limited access, I should point that out, they would gravitate to the problem spots. I took 2 years, tried to look at the whole program, and I would say it was a mixed success, but I think on balance a success. So I'm going to stop there and just throw it open, let Michael handle it from here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. Washington is always hungry for on-the-ground accounts from Afghanistan, particularly now with the war at such a critical point, with theoretically the full withdrawal just about 14 months away. So this is a very welcome contribution. Thank you. I'm going to open things up to all of you, but before that, I'm just going to abuse the privilege of chairing the session to pose one broad question to you. Essentially, you want to try to broaden this debate a bit and really get you to a question about wider political implications of U.S. Special Operation Forces, and on two levels. One, the implications of U.S. relations with governments in countries where special forces operate. You mentioned, rightly, probably the bin Laden raid is perhaps a caricature and not necessarily the most representative of what special ops forces represent. But at the same time, that incident helped plunge U.S.-Pakistani relations to one of their lowest levels ever. And in that country, the notion of special forces, special ops, has a pretty bad reputation. Now, perhaps more relevantly, in Afghanistan, President Hamid Karzai earlier this year ordered special forces to withdraw from their areas of authority. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And the second level of political implications is on relations with other U.S. Military forces. You've talked a bit about the tensions, disagreements with conventional forces, but I believe that your book gets a bit into issues about clashes with the CIA. So I'm wondering if you could get into that a bit. So basically the question is, how significant and how serious are these political implications?
Thank you, Michael. Good questions, and I hope I have them all because I would like to address in some detail what the good things you've raised. So remind me if I miss anything. Pakistan, there's no more neuralgic relationship, as you all here, part of the Asia program, South Asia program, know. And we've seen it's really been a venue for what I would call a fratricide of U.S. special ops approaches. We've used drones, we've used raids. We had a partnered training operation there where we were training Pakistani forces. U.S. SOF were training Pakistani forces in counterinsurgency, and it blew up as the relationship cratered. And it cratered, I think, largely for two reasons. One is the U.S. and Pakistan's interests were not, they're not totally aligned, and there's always been friction about that. But it was exacerbated by the application of unilateral force. And, when you do use unilateral force in another country's territory, that is pretty much an act of war. So we are not technically at war with Pakistan, but we've been making war in Pakistan. And we keep trying to square that circle. And for a long time, we were trying to forge a strategic partnership with Pakistan. And I would say for Pakistan's side, they have, I think, continued to hold on to a security approach that I would characterize as expedient reliance on proxies, and particularly in the form of the Haqqani network. That they see them as their trump card with regard to the future of Afghanistan. And no matter what the Haqqanis do, no matter how many times they will attack U.S. forces in Afghanistan or whatever their alliance is with al-Qaeda forces, they have been unwilling to take the necessary measures to rein them in. And I think that is the nub of the conflict that has to get resolved. But I would observe that what we have tried to do in partnership with Pakistan has really run aground on our unilateral approach. It's interesting, and there's been this in the news in the last week, that Pakistan actually sanctioned the use of drones. This is also the case with President Hadi in Yemen. Another place where drones have been used. But I would make the observation that this, despite the approval of a head of government or a head of state, it puts that government in a very untenable position with regard to its population. And the discontent with an act of war on someone's territory can, I think, lead to an undermining of that government, even if that government agrees. So I think it remains problematic. And that has been acknowledged by others. It's just a question then of trying to say, how can we minimize the drone use to the absolute minimum necessary, and what are the legal provisions covering that. Wardak, you mentioned, that was the place where President Karzai asked initially for all U.S. special operators to leave, and it wound up being one district, and then they pulled out voluntarily of another district. This is part of the complexity of Wardak, and I would try to sum it up in two ways. One is there is a very significant one element of the Taliban insurgency is very strong there and has ties into the government of Wardak province, but all the way up to the national level. And so certain versions of things were getting to Karzai, with the U.S. now in a very troubled relationship with Karzai, having very little credibility and saying, well, it's not exactly what's going on, let's give you another story. So this really spun up into a very big bilateral issue, what to do in Wardak and what exactly were the facts on the ground. There was also former governor Fidai in Wardak, the Afghan governor of the province, once complained to a U.S. commander who was visiting. He says, you guys have treated Wardak province like your petri dish. You've tried every conceivable experiment in this place, and then you go on to try something different. And I think that's a correct observation. There was an early form of the civil defense effort, AP3, tried there, given over to the conventional forces, turned into a very unsuccessful experiment. So it's just been a highly problematic province. And then finally, you asked me to address the issue of the CIA. And there, for people who've read Bob Woodward's book, you know, that was where he first broke the story of how extensive the CIA on the ground presence was. And my observation, and I just would run into, they're really formally Afghan intelligence assets, these forces, but they don't have very good command and control. They are presumably supposed to be working right along the border, but they, in fact, regularly cause a lot of havoc with the U.S. Special Operations Forces. So the observation that I make in the book is someone needs to define the division of labor and the territorial division of who's working where and doing what. And this was causing a lot of consternation to Afghan local officials, as they would find, in one case in Paktika, these guys were going into the market high on hashish, and no one was really answering for them. So I think this is something going forward. There needs to be, whether it's the Afghan intelligence service or whoever is actually supposed to be exercising command and control over these forces, if indeed they need to continue to exist, that needs to be cleared up. And of course, this is a classic problem where you have two chains of command. You have a military chain of command and an intelligence chain of command, and that needs to get worked out. And no military commander, certainly no U.S. military commander, was in a position to resolve this. They didn't have the authority. So it was, again, something I ran into in several occasions and felt it was important to note.
Okay, thank you. All right, try to get these questions answered. If you could wait for a microphone to arrive, we're live webcasting this event. So if you could wait for the microphone to arrive, and then if you could give your name and affiliation and try to keep your question brief. So yes, start with Bob.
Bob Hathaway here at the Center. Linda, welcome back. It's nice to have you. It's nice to see that we had a small hand in what I know is a very successful book. Let me get you to talk about your title, specifically two parts of it that you didn't really touch on very much, one being the end of it, the future of American warfare. I know from other things you've written that you think that special ops might have a fairly large future, or ought to have a fairly large future. Explain that a little bit more, if you will, and particularly inasmuch as special ops at this point have such a small percentage of the total DoD budget, I'm not quite sure I understand how they win the intra-Pentagon contest to have a much larger role, if in fact that's where you see them going. The other is your first three words, 100 victories. This, I'm sure, suggests how old I am. But the first thing I thought of when I first saw that was the conversation back in the 1970s between a U.S. military officer and a Vietnamese general. The U.S. military officer says, you know, we won every battle we fought, and then the Vietnamese says, yes, but you lost the war. You probably have a very different meaning, but that, at least to those of us of a certain age, that's what it evoked for me. So explain that title, part of the title, please.
Thank you, Bob. And again, I just really loved my time here, and I appreciate your hosting me. I'm glad to have the opportunity to say more about both of those things. The future of special operations, first of all, the reason why I think they're going to be used much more, despite their being a very small fraction of the overall U.S. military and a very small fraction of its overall budget, is the current defense strategic guidance really does call for the use of a small footprint approach to national security. And I think that is, technology enables these forces to go out and have an outsized impact, whether it's in the direct action mode or what I see increasingly is this partnered mode. So you can go and send a few special operations teams to a country, which is what happened actually in the Philippines and Colombia. A very small footprint deployed for a decade really helped those countries resolve serious threats. And in the case of Colombia, a countrywide threat. And I spent a lot of time in Colombia, and it was very much on the brink of a kind of anarchic collapse. I would not say a guerrilla takeover, but the government did not have control over well over half of its territory. And now they are in final stages of negotiations. The leadership of that guerrilla group, 40 years of war, decapitated. So you do get to an end game through a small footprint approach to security. It is not a panacea. It will not work everywhere, but I think the option that it represents is between a big war, which I do not see us engaging in, frankly, anywhere, probably in my lifetime, but it is certainly, I think, going to be the most extreme case or circumstances that would drive us to deploy 100,000 plus troops somewhere anytime in the near future. And the other pole is, of course, stay home, do nothing. Let the threats multiply out there, become what I would see as kind of a neo-isolationist power where we just try to avoid any foreign entanglements. A small footprint approach together with other elements of the U.S. government. So I don't want to at all be interpreted as seeing a future where we're just using the military alone. Although I do lament that post-Benghazi, there is even more terror on the part of U.S. diplomats to get out into the conflict zones, and I lament that. And I watched in Afghanistan as the regional security officer was really restricting those civilians from getting out, and that needs to change. There's also a move on by the Army for a concept called regional alignment of forces, where they're trying to take their brigades, offer them up to the geographic combatant commander, and then break them down into smaller size units. But this is still very much a work in progress. So you would, for example, I neglected to mention, in Afghanistan, in the village stability operations, they broke down infantry battalions, U.S. conventional infantry battalions, and sent out squads with many of these teams to help them and help secure them, provide additional security, because it would just be one lone team out there in a district. And those conventional forces need to be carefully selected, trained, and they need to have time with that special operations unit before going downrange to become familiar with them. So that is part of the formula of the future, and it's still in the making. So I would say the to-do list is pretty long. On the subtitle, thank you for asking me, because it's kind of an ironic title, 100 Victories, and some reviewer mistook it as me touting 100 victories. It's a quote from Sun Tzu, and the quote is inside the book. And the quote, I'll give you the full quote, it's the acme of skill is not to win 100 victories in 100 battles, but to subdue the enemy without fighting. So it is really a book title meant to connote the turn toward a non-lethal and non-combat application of special operations forces.
Okay, a question here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist. When I was doing a project some years ago on the Patani uprising in southern Thailand, I read an article in a Pacific Command journal by a special forces operator who made a rather impassioned and well-reasoned call for U.S. Special Forces to be used to help in the Patani uprising. You don't need to be familiar with that uprising for my question. A lot of people who were military specialists, Southeast Asia specialists, however, dismissed this as possibly the absolute worst solution to this problem, and concluded that the author was taking sort of a hammer and nail approach. This was all he knew, and so he was making the argument that special forces should be used where many of these people thought it was inappropriate. My question to you, because you've been on the ground, is this a danger that people whose orientation is towards special operations forces will only see that as the universal response, and it will be used in occasions that it shouldn't be. Thanks.
That's a great question, and of course there is this saying, right? If you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So I think this is a real injunction not to see special operations forces as a panacea for every conflict in the world. And indeed, I think the point is not to sprinkle special ops around like fairy dust. The current deployment is somewhere to 70 countries per year. And it seems to me it's impossible to expect to have lasting strategic level effect by that kind of employment of a small force. I think it's much more important that the command focus on the key areas and figure out how they can have a truly I hate that word game changing, but a truly enduring impact in those places where it matters to U.S. interests, not to be given out like a political reward or just an engagement tool. You know, we spend a lot of time and effort training these forces, and they really are meant to go out and stay and work with local populations and local forces. I don't know the example of Thailand, but I would like to say I know that we have been partnered with Thailand for many years. The special operators have deployed there, and I do know they have internal conflicts. They have a history of coups, and I would just take this opportunity to say, you know, it's very important. We have a law, the Leahy Amendment, that requires that all units that are going to receive training be vetted. And I think that represents a very important principle because the U.S. does not want to be seen as empowering abusive units. But over time, I'll give the Mali example. There was a lot of press about the coup in Mali being conducted by a colonel who had received U.S. training. But the one unit that stayed loyal to the constitutional government was the unit that had received the most intensive training by special ops. U.S. special operators. So I think it's important to look at the nuance, look at where you want to apply them, and make sure you're applying them in a sophisticated way. I think that what is going on, I was out at Monterey at the Naval Postgraduate School last week, where the largest special operators education program is. They go for 18 months and they get a master's degree, and I was very impressed. It's an extremely rigorous program. You know, a civilian academic staff, very high standards. And I think what they are doing is really developing a new generation of very sophisticated social scientists, really. I mean, they're armed with a lot of social science tools. They take a very deliberate, serious approach to the problems they're given. And I think it represents a new level of professionalism in the force.
U.S. officials discern when it's appropriate to use special
Oh, this is absolutely a policy decision as far as what country they're employed in.
doing a great job of it.
I think, and I hope that some of my work is educating them on the full range of special ops applications and not being in love with the drone and the raid.
Okay, let's go to a question here. The woman in the green, I think it's a green jacket.
Thank you. I'm going to stay seated, if that's okay, so I don't block. Kristen Cairns, USAID. I appreciate you writing this book. I was out embedded with USSOF for the last 2 years myself as the development advisor in the West and Southwest, so we missed you out there. But two questions. Hoping you referenced it a little bit, but hoping you could talk a little bit more about interagency partnerships that you observed. We have a thick skin here, so it's okay if they were negative. And then the second being your thoughts on the development governance components of VSO moving forward in future engagements.
Thank you so much for that question, because I do try in my talks to work in mention of what I felt was the most effective civilian partner, and it was in the person of a woman, Mary Ketman, who spent 2 years in Paktika. I see your head nodding. She is, to me, an amazing what I would like to say, muddy boots diplomat or development worker. She lives in Africa. She's been all over every conflict zone of Africa. The Marines have grabbed onto her and are using her now in Helmand as they wrap up there. And she's been in great demand, and she has lived a life of both development work and conflict resolution. And I think that's an excellent partnership. USAID, and I understand that a lot of development organizations and a lot of non-governmental organizations don't want to have a close relationship with the military because they're afraid that it would lead them to be viewed as military or militaristic, and that can affect their ability to do their jobs. And I did have a number of them explain to me that they just absolutely can't expose their local partners to the kind of threat that may occur. And so, but yet Mary, she found a way to make it work. And she really provided some very good community training, but the special operators would usually go into a district or a conflicted village first, and once it was somewhat pacified, she would be able to come in and do her work. And this is why, why people ask, why can't this just be a civilian effort alone? Why do we need the military? And the problem is it's just too insecure. Someone like Mary could just not survive and work out there without that partnership. And I made that comment, though, about the regional security officer, which is in every embassy and has an extraordinary amount of power. The time that I was going there, Ambassador Crocker, Ryan Crocker, was the ambassador for most of that time. And I would report back to him because I always stopped to see him and the other high command. I didn't spend a lot of time in Kabul, but I would work my way down. And when I came back, I would say, your people aren't getting out. And he'd say, oh, that can't be right, Linda. I said, well, call so-and-so, because I really felt very strongly that you went to this trouble to deploy civilians out there, and then they get restricted to a base, which now they can't even visit the base, stay overnight, unless they're posted there. I see your heads nodding. So this is my big cause to try to help the civilians do their jobs.
Yes, you've had your hand up for a while, right down here at the
Frank Fletcher, independent researcher on international relations. I thought your comment about the context you set by going back to Vietnam was fascinating because it was General Creighton Abrams when he took over in 1968, and that period till 72 when the tactics, the strategy really changed, and an emphasis was put on village security and what you said. What I don't know, and either related in the Vietnam context or here to what you're referring to in Afghanistan, who is responsible for that? Was that a presidential policy, or sometimes a president can say, I want something done differently, it's not working, but turns to his Secretary of Defense, who turns to JCS, who in turn might, being conventional people, might produce something that's a more conventional forces type solution, which is characteristic of most of our deployments in Iraq in the beginning. And so I'm not sure in the Afghan context. And then as a corollary to that, I think very related would be, I've heard talk that could we have a situation whereby special forces would be in the lead and the conventional forces would be in a supporting role. I heard so many veterans of Vietnam, I was in the military post-Vietnam in artillery, say, had we allowed the special forces to take the lead and had they determined, we might have done better sooner.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Good, excellent points, and I will try to answer them fully, but still stay brief. In this case of who stimulated it or who brought it about, it was kind of an interesting, there were many people that seemed to come to, we need to focus on local defense at the same time. But I do, in the first couple of chapters of the book, I give kind of a truncated account of the special ops community itself moving and having some of their leadership after many tours in Afghanistan, sort of, we keep playing whack-a-mole, we can't keep doing this, it's not working. I think they had some help from some academics and some people that were looking at Afghanistan, has, it's still heavily rural society. And we were building, kind of from the top down, if as it were. Government structures largely Kabul-based, an army that didn't yet reach out to the countryside, government wasn't reaching out to the countryside. There are really two Afghanistans. I mean, I've seen the cities move by great leaps and bounds over the last decade, but rural Afghanistan is still rural Afghanistan in a totally different place. So the idea was, especially in these Pashtun areas, which is where I focused, to use that grassroots structure and use that bottom up, use that incentive that communities had to defend themselves. So I would say the impetus really came from the operators and from people they reached out to. It was not imposed from Washington. Now, Special Ops in the Lead is a very interesting story, and I deal with that somewhat in the last two chapters of the book. I think the time has come because they have gained enough experience and maturity and are thinking now at the operational level, not just at the tactical level, which is really where they've operated for all of their history until now. And they now have a general and flag officer cadre. General officer means thinking generally and being able to see the broader picture. So what is wrong, though, or why didn't they get that? They don't have the command structures. This one that brought all the soft tribes together that I mentioned is still an ad hoc command. It was a command formed piecemeal by what's called a joint manning document. It was put together as a pickup team to go over there to Afghanistan. What they need if they're going to be able to lead these efforts is an organic full-time command that is capable of leading countrywide efforts. And over 10 years, and it's no detriment to these individuals, but over 10 years we had 06s, colonels, leading a task force that were responsible for the entire country, both in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. And these colonels were just not prepared to do the kind of campaign planning, multi-year efforts, much less all of the complicated logistics and interagency coordination needed. So I think we're just now getting at the point where they're able to do that. And they did. Admiral McRaven of the Special Operations Command did propose it. The Army said, thanks, but no thanks. We'll keep leading the command structures until the end of the war. But I think they're now in a position to propose it credibly the next time there is a countrywide effort. And indeed, this is probably what Admiral McRaven's legacy is going to be, is actually to create capable command structures to do that.
Okay, unfortunately, we have time for one more question. This gentleman right here.
I'm Timothy Towell, a retired Foreign Service officer, 31 years plus, mostly developing nations. I look forward to your book. I picked up a couple of phrases you used. I like language, and I don't trust language about throwing terrorist language at people. I like to call them good guys and bad guys, or our guys or their guys, and do something about it. I liked your emphasis on complexity, good, bad, and the ugly. I can't wait to read that. And the to-do list. What do we do to make sure that local people in Afghanistan or wherever don't view uniform American boys and women in uniform, and they wear nasty uniforms now, unlike my day as a private when it was just olive drab and a 9.5-pound rifle. What do we do to prevent the locals from viewing us as the bad guys? I have to confess, I'm an Irish American, and my great-great-grandparents didn't like foreigners in uniform on our country. The Wimps took a boat to Tip O'Neill, South Boston, and the others stayed behind and shot them. What are we doing to make absolutely sure that we don't get shot?
Yes.
And let me also say, my last job was regional director for Africa at the Peace Corps, and every time there was tom-tom in the bushes, some security officer or some manager here that really should take care of keeping the lights on would try and pull our people out of my countries. I had to go to them and then go across the street to the White House and get the NSC guys to join me to remind these people who should be changing light bulbs that these are young people in the service of their nation. They're patriots, and they should get out and get engaged, and if some get injured, that's what they do. If you don't want to do service to your nation, become a junk bombardier dealer or be a hedge fund kid.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate your comments, and I think the best way I can answer it is to give you an anecdote that may illustrate what I saw work and what I think are the attributes that make it work. This small footprint before, I think, is critical. To have overwhelming numbers in any country is automatically going to set those people's teeth on edge. But I will tell you about Captain Dan Hayes. He was the captain who stayed in Maiwand province in Kandahar for the longest time. And there are two pictures in the book, and I hate to say I'm a writer, but pictures do tell fabulous stories. And he's there with his 4 old, craggy Afghan local police commanders, and he looks like their son. And he would wear, the traditional clothing, and he grew a beard, and he has kind of a little bit of an Asian look, and he just looked just like their son, and they thought he was their son. And so they developed a very warm relationship. But the key technique he used, I think, was really very important. He would never speak in the meetings. He would talk to them or talk to the district governor, the mayor, or the chief of police before the meeting or after the meeting, but he let them run their business. He did not interfere, and this always troubled me when I would go into these meetings or shuras, and I would see Americans in their uniforms sitting at the table, being too engaged and too frontal. And this is, of course, Americans, we like to get things done, we like to speak up, so it really required that finesse. And Dan was perfect at it, and many others, but I think he really had that ability, and he had kind of a humor to him, and he could just work with people in an easy way. Of course, it wasn't easy, and they had a lot of difficulties out there. It was an extremely dangerous and trying place. And as I said, he spent half of his first tour with no success whatsoever. Went home, they all thought they'd failed, and then they came back and suddenly things started happening. People were happy to see them. The medic had treated a lot of the children. So they had planted the seeds that then came to fruition. And that's the other key thing. Do we have the patience for this kind of approach, or do we just want to wait until a problem gets so severe that we're going to, drop a bomb or unleash, the holy hell? And I just, I know that Americans like to solve their problems quickly, but it's just an interesting example of what a little patience and a small footprint can produce. Thank you.
Well, don't know if the temperature down there is as cold as it is up here. If so, I imagine everyone's probably getting a bit restless and wants to repair somewhere warmer. So we will need to wrap up. Again, I remind you that Linda's book is for sale outside. Some significant holidays are coming up, maybe not Halloween, but others beyond that. So feel free to purchase a copy. And if we could just give this has been great. Thank you to Linda. If we could give a round of applause. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.